All right, everybody. Well, this week we're going to get into sound devices, and we're gonna really understand something about sound this week. There are actually so many sound devices. We're going to take a couple weeks working on them, and we're going to start this week by just talking about the term sound devices because it is a big term. It's an umbrella term. There are lots of terms that are underneath it. So just like figurative language is this huge, huge umbrella term, and every term that we have is underneath that. Sound devices is a big umbrella term, and there are lots of devices that fall under that one. Specifically, unsurprisingly, sound devices are meant to appeal to the ear. And so, when I've talked in the past about poetry as this art form that is meant to be both read and heard, the read part is very much trying to uncode it and demystify it and understand why the author is using all these words. And the sound part is more that Billy Collins approach to just appreciating the surface of a poem or putting the poem up to your ear and listening to it. All of the sounds that we're going to talk about, they show up in a variety of different ways. And of course, we're most used to hearing sound devices like rhyme and rhyme scheme and those types of things. So of course, we're going to start with those. All of them are meant to be heard aloud, so that's really important. And if you're somebody who struggles with hearing sounds or something like that, it's important to let me know. So let's go ahead and dive in. We're going to start by talking about the basic stuff, rhyme and rhyme scheme. This one we really know. Rhyme in the English language is actually the last syllable of one word matching with the last syllable of another word. So like hush and blush both have that ush sound at the end of their word. And so if you put them together, right, they rhyme. English is actually not designed to do this very well. So we can see the creativeness of an author who's willing to put in a rhyme scheme or some rhyme because it doesn't work as well. Those of you who are taking Spanish or French probably notice that their words naturally rhyme or are much more likely to. And our language is not built that way. We actually have the strict syllable structure that makes it easier for our words to mimic each other in different ways that we won't entirely get to in this course. We can rhyme at the end of the line. That's called end rhyme, not surprisingly. Or you can rhyme in the middle of a line. That's what we call internal rhyme scheme or internal rhyme. And we have, of course, all types of different rhymes, accidental rhyme, patterns of rhyme. That's what we call rhyme scheme. And that's what we're going to get into next. So a rhyme scheme is simply a consistent pattern that the author is putting into the rhymes of the poem. So usually rhyme scheme deals with end lines, and I would end my first line with blush, and then I would end my second line with hush, and then I would end my third line with a new sound, ound, and then my fourth line with an ound. And you can see if I'm going back as the reader and marking this, then I'm going to use letters to mark the sound. So the first sound, I'm always going to use the letter A. The second sound, the letter B, etc. If you're all the way ahead of me and thinking, what if the poem is so long it has more than 26 rhymes? Well, then we use AA actually to indicate that we're on our 27th rhyme. But that's pretty rare. We don't usually get that. The scheme is actually the thing that's interesting. Has the author put it in a scheme? Is it kind of a typical line 1 and line 2 rhymes, then line 3 and line 4 rhymes? Is the author doing something interesting by putting in something else? And we actually have different kinds of poems that have different specific rhyme schemes. So in this class, we're going to talk about the sonnet. The sonnet, for example, has 14 lines and it has 7 different rhymes, rhyme sounds, and they're orchestrated, they're organized in such a way that it creates a pattern. Okay, so we'll get to that when we get to sonnets next week. Other familiar words, onomatopoeia, probably the one that we all remember the most from elementary school. It's not a very difficult one to understand because while it is abstract, we understand that we need to make words for sounds. That's how language is orchestrated. And so what happens when we have a sound that is also the word? That's what we call onomatopoeia. So bang is more the sound of two pans clashing together. I just use the word clash. And so that's how we developed it. It was just as simple as we heard it, and therefore we wrote it down that way. Buzz is another one. If you think of a buzz saw, the buzz is being descriptive of the type of saw it is because of the sound more than anything else. It's we have other terms that we should use for buzz saw, but we typically use a buzz saw when we're talking about a handsaw. Alliteration is a really powerful sound device where we're using sounds at the beginning of words and we're repeating those sounds to create a kind of repetition of sound. Alliteration is usually two or more sounds. That's how it's usually defined. I find two to be a little accidental. So Sally sells, yes, is definitely alliteration. But Sally sells seashells. Now we're into, okay, we're not accidentally using this device now. We have to be intentionally using the device. The proximity of the S's at the beginning of the words is what's really important. So as you see in our example, Sally sells seashells by the seashore. We can kind of get over the by the sound because seashore is so close to seashells and sells and Sally. So we can kind of forgive that a little bit. This is another one where I don't like, Barbara is promoting her seashell sale on the beach. Like seashell sale is just a little coincidental there, her seashell on the beach sale. Then we really don't hear that sound at all. So we want to hear the sounds in close proximity. We'll get next week into two terms that break it down even further, what alliteration is. But alliteration is a very simple but very powerful little sound device that kind of just gives our ears a kick. I wanted to be sure to include imagery on this list. Typically, when we think about imagery, we think about something that we imagine with our eyes. But writing is much more than that. Writing is encapsulating, and good writing causes us to kind of fill our entire imagination with the piece, right? So imagery can actually connect to all of your senses: sight, touch, sound, and smell, and feeling as well. That's touch and feeling are the same thing. You get my drift. So what are we doing here? We're wanting to be incredibly descriptive. So instead of saying red, right? Red is not very descriptive. Even if we say fire truck red or as red as a fire truck, we're not being very descriptive. You're being more descriptive than just saying red, but you're at least attempting something here. But her eyes smoldered as if they were burning coals still ablaze. That's red, right? This is a very intense kind of red that we don't want to see. And that image is very powerful. So there are going to be some instances where we get imagery of a sound that's so powerful that we can kind of hear it. And so I didn't want to exclude imagery from my list here. There are many, many other kinds of sound devices, and we're going to get into those next week. But I did want to remind us that sound devices and rhythmic poetry has a counterbalance that we call free verse poetry that lacks these kinds of structures. They lack things like rhyme scheme, meter, or stanza structure, and they are going to do things all on their own. So, typically, when students think about poetry, they think about poetry either rhyming or not rhyming, and that's another way that we can think free verse right is a non-rhyming kind of poetry, whereas most poetry for all of time has had some kind of rhyme scheme or some kind of rhythm, and free verse is a very new kind of poetry that doesn't have those things. So I did want to give us a stark contrast between the types of things that we're learning in the class as we wrap up our notes this week.